So it does give me great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Father Matt Malone. I am a great fan of American Magazine, and I read his of many things. I look forward to it all the time when the magazine comes. And it does my heart good when I get the magazine, because it's one of the tools in my life that inspire me to believe, to use Father Bonaventure's language a little bit that we heard yesterday, that there is a maturity somewhere in our population today. And it gives me great joy when I read the magazine and hope and inspiration that our future will be okay. So I thank you, Matt, for that wonderful magazine. So, Father Matt Malone is the president and editor-in-chief of American Media. Father Malone began his tenure on October 1st, 2012. Previously, he served for 2 years as an associate editor from 2007 to 2009, when he covered foreign policy and domestic politics. God bless you.
It was easier then.
I'm sure. Father Malone entered the Society of Jesus in 2002. He was ordained a priest on June 9th, 2012, by Edward Cardinal Egan, late Archbishop of New York. Prior to religious life, Father Malone served as a special assistant and speechwriter to U.S. Representative Martin T. Meehan, a Democrat from Massachusetts. From 1997 to 2002, he served as the founding deputy director of Mass Inc., an independent political think tank and co-publisher of Commonwealth, its award-winning review of politics, ideas, and civic life. He is the author, I don't speak French, so please forgive me, of Catholics sans etiquette, a book concerning the church and the political, which was published in 2014 by Salvatore Press in Paris. Father Malone was a founding member of REMIS, Religion, Mimesis, and Society, an interdisciplinary research group at Haythrop College dedicated to the thought of René Girard, a member of the Colloquium on Violence and Religion, and serves as the chaplain to the New York Press Club. And so it gives me great honor to introduce Father Matt Malone.
This is a... Yeah. Oh, okay. That is a problem with being 6'4". It really is truly, can everyone hear me? Good. My brothers and sisters, it gives me a great consolation to be with you this morning and to share this time with you. I'm sorry that my time with you is short. I'm attending the Aspen Institute's Ideas Festival in Aspen, Colorado this week, and taking part in some panels there, trying to engage in a conversation with the secular world about faith and politics, which, as you can imagine, is not straightforward in the time in which we live. I wonder if how many of you went to a Jesuit school, have a degree in some way from a Jesuit school? Oh, that's great. Okay. So some of this will be familiar to you, or if we didn't do our job, it won't be. And hopefully it will, because Jesuits are constitutionally incapable of admitting that we've made a mistake. There is so this morning I wanted to talk with you for just a few minutes about the Jesuit that is the Bishop of Rome, and what it means to have a Jesuit as Pope, how it informs his worldview, and how it informs his pastoral strategy for this hour in the church's life. I think that the key to understanding Francis, I should say first off, is not so much that he is a Jesuit, but that he is a religious. And in that sense, the church, in her wisdom, called from the periphery someone to govern from its center. And that's a different kind of choice than the church has traditionally made. I mean, there have been other popes who were religious, but not in modern times. And as you know, every religious order, so many of you belong to one, is born in a spirit of reform. You know, the Jesuit historian John O'Malley says that the principal ecclesiological difference between Catholics and Protestants is that when Protestants disagree with each other, they found new churches. And when Catholics disagree with each other, we found new religious orders. Right? It is a way in which the church breathes with both lungs. It is the way in which we can change and yet still be one. The way in which we can hold fast to what we have received as gift, principally the gift of revelation, and yet discern the lights and shadows of and the signs of the times. Now, there is an old expression that, in understanding the Jesuits, there is an old expression that if you buy a Jesuit a beer, he'll talk about anything. If you buy him two, then he'll talk about God. And, of course, there's a bit of humor in that, but there's a little bit of truth in it. But it's not because God is in any way other to us. It's not because God is in some way far from our hearts. It's a little difficult sometimes, though some people do it with quite great skill, like Father James Martin, my colleague at America. But it can sometimes be a little difficult for a Jesuit to talk about God, to talk about Jesus, precisely because of his nearness to us and our experience of him in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius of Loyola. As you know, it is through the spiritual exercises, which are the foundational element of every Jesuit's life, that a Jesuit comes to have a personal encounter with the living God. For those of you who may not know, the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius are a series of reflections in their fullest reflections and prayers and movements in their fullest extent over a 4-week period, in which the exercitant, as Master Ignatius called him, enters into a life of Jesus Christ, his death and resurrection, and in light of that, evaluates the shadows in his own life, his own sinfulness, and the sheer gratuity of his redemption. This, apart from anything else, is at the core of a Jesuit. It's funny because Jesuits are known for a lot of things, some famous, some infamous, but prescinding from the schools and the universities and the intellectual training and so forth and so on, what binds us together, what is at the heart of our lives as Jesuits, is this encounter with Jesus Christ, the Son of the living God, in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. And it is not an intellectual encounter at all. In fact, it is the foundation of our intellectual freedom. It is an encounter with a person, the person of Jesus Christ, alive today, whose spirit is in our midst, guiding us in our steps. I think that is fundamentally important to understanding how Pope Francis has approached not just his ministry as the successor of Peter, but his ministry as a bishop, as a priest, as a Jesuit. It's an encounter with the God of love, who is truth. Right? And that encounter culminates in this lived realization of the sheer gratuity of our creation and our redemption. This happens to align, this encounter with the person of Jesus Christ and the spiritual exercises that animates a Jesuit's life, but in a particular public and visible way animates the life of this Jesuit who is currently the Bishop of Rome. This happens to align very well, you might say that even the Spirit is at work in this, with what we might say, I think, is the most important teaching of the Second Vatican Council. You know, and that is principally, as it's contained in Dei Verbum, that truth for Catholics is ultimately a person. So, as you know, in the modern era, we have essentially wrestled as a culture, as a people, certainly in the West, with these two competing notions of truth. And the first is that truth is basically a proposition, a statement that corresponds to an objective reality. That chair is red, right? It's strictly propositional. It can be empirically verified. That's what truth is, right? It's utterly reductionistic. The second is that truth isn't so much of an objective reality, right? We might call this a kind of personal understanding of truth. It's not an objective reality at all. It's a subjective reality. I don't discover truth. I decide what is truth, or I make truth, me, an individual. And the Second Vatican Council came along and did something really remarkable. Gave us a way forward through that struggling. It said, you know, truth is ultimately personal. So modernity's got that part right. But here's the part that it got wrong. That person isn't you, and it isn't me, right? It's the person of Jesus Christ, the way and the truth and the life, right? And when we substitute any other notion of truth for that personal understanding of truth, that personalist definition of truth, then truth acquires the potential for violence. It becomes a weapon. It becomes a something that we beat each other over the head with, rather than a someone whom we encounter, right, and come to know. That foundational element of the Church's teaching, the Second Vatican Council, also lies at the heart of the spiritual exercises. And these two experiences have merged in this pontificate. Right? And so what Pope Francis has decided to do in this moment in the life of the Church, some 50-odd years on from the Second Vatican Council, at the dawn of post-modernity, as I'm sure all these scholars around here would tell you we're living through, he has decided that what is most important right now is to reorient the pastoral priorities of the Church to focus them on the person. And that manifests itself in several ways. The first is that our pastoral strategy, if it is to be effective, if it is to be credible, if it is to be true, must be based on encounter rather than confrontation, right? And it is the recovery of this personalist notion of truth from the Council, adapted to the pastoral realities in which we live, that give us the freedom to do that, right? In other words, our engagement with the world cannot be about being right. It has to be about being holy. Because ultimately, the Church is, ultimately we as Christians, the object of our lives as disciples of Jesus Christ is not, strictly speaking, to be right, but to be holy, right? To live in the holiness of truth, the one who is truth. And so in that sense, what Francis is saying to the Church, to you and to me, is that it is not so much that we possess the truth. It is that we live in the hope that he possesses us. So first, it's about a strategy that is encounter rather than confrontation. Secondly, these two moments meet in this man and in his decision to lead us in this direction, in encounter rather than confrontation. Secondly, in the lived reality that what we experience as Christians, as Catholic Christians, what we experience as a church, and what we offer the world is personal before it is propositional, right? So propositions are important, right? The dogmas of the church are a set of propositions which we assent to every Sunday. But ultimately, if truth is a person, then our encounter with other people in their personhood, where they live, has to be personal as well, right? In other words, it has to be based in the reality, not that we are bringing them a proposition to which they must assent, but that we are inviting them into a relationship, right, with a person who has redeemed us and can redeem them. Right. And the third and related element in that pastoral approach that the Pope is inviting us to is that if it's not about encounter, if it's about encounter rather than confrontation, if it's about the personal rather than the propositional, then fundamentally it's also about relationship more than rules, right? So the Pope is not saying that rules don't matter. In fact, as a Jesuit, and he admitted to this in his interview with Father Pastoral that we published in American Magazine, he could be a little authoritarian at times about the rules. But he's learned from that experience. And what he has said to us is that, rules are important. They matter, right? But the ultimate end of a set of rules is to safeguard loving relationships, right? That it is relationship that matters most, right? In other words, the catechism of the church is an expression of the lived experience of the church on its pilgrimage in time and space. It's not a penal code, and it's not a party political platform, right? It's utterly different from our secular politics. The people of God who have carried this revelation are not the we the people of our politics, right? And that is fundamentally important. He's not saying that the rules don't matter. He hasn't changed the rules. What he is saying is that it's in the world in which we live today, and frankly, in light of what the Council has taught and his own lived experiences of the spiritual exercises, what he's saying is that the rules are only intelligible in a lived way, in an experiential way, in an existential way, in the context of a living relationship with the one who is truth. It is only in the light of the truth who is Jesus Christ that we can begin to discern the other truths in our lives and actually live them. Which brings me to the fourth element of this approach, which is it's more about praxis than it is about principle. It's more about how we live. We've had a prolonged debate in this country. Much of it occurred in the pages of American Magazine the last 50 years about the work of John Courtney Murray, who many of you may have heard of, who is a political theologian who gave us, in large part, the Declaration on Religious Freedom from the Second Vatican Council, and he wrestled with this question: is the United States compatible with Catholicism or vice versa? And I think the Pope is reminding us today that this question, way up here, intellectual, involves so many levels of abstraction that it quickly loses its bearings. And what we actually need to be focused on today is how we live our lives. In other words, if we call ourselves a Christian country, but we don't live like Christians, what does it matter to say that the U.S. is a Christian country? You know, if you say that you are a Christian, and yet you find it hard to get out of bed on Sunday to go to church, or you spend the rest of your week in the relentless pursuit of profits in the bond markets, then what is absolute in your life is not God, it's something else, right? The question, the times that is often asked is not is there a God, it's who is your God? I can tell you who mine is, but because everybody has one, right? And the question is, who is your God? And how do you actually live your life? In other words, how we live is what is essential, right? It is praxis more than principle, right? Which brings me to the next element of this approach, I think, that the Pope is bringing in light of his experience of the exercises and the teaching of the Council. The Church is meant by her very nature, by the evangelical impulse and trajectory of the gospel itself, to advance and not to retreat. And that must be true if our experience of God as our Creator and Redeemer is true. In other words, if all is a gift, if all of creation truly is a gift, and we live out of the reality of the sheer gratuity of our creation and redemption, then we must not be afraid of any element in creation. B, it can call forth from us a deeper response to God. And C, we ought to go out to meet it, right? There's a fundamental faith there that drives, that leads us outward, out of ourselves. You know, the Pope has cautioned us against kind of a narcissistic, ecclesial narcissism, right? Are we focused on us and our ecclesial politicking and our own concerns, or is the Church looking outward? You know, through the spiritual exercises, the Pope has been able to learn how to discern the lights and the shadows, as some of you have through your own experiences of your spirituality, or perhaps your experience of the spiritual exercises, has been able to discern that you know, a movement outward is a movement of the Spirit, and a movement inward, in ourselves, is not. You know, a movement toward fear is not a movement of the Spirit. A movement toward faith is. An act of love is a movement of the Spirit. A cry for love is a movement crying out for the Spirit. Right? And I think, finally, the way in which he's inviting us as a church to engage with the secular world is in light of the fact that in light of what the church teaches and of his own experiences as a Christian and specifically as a Jesuit. In light of the fact that our mission in the world today is encounter rather than confrontation, that it must be personal rather than propositional, that it privileges relationship over rules, that it's about advance rather than retreat. Our engagement with the secular world has to be about truth in the personal way in which we have understood it, and I just articulated it, and not about ideology. Right? The Church, the Holy Father dislikes three things. One is greed, the second is prunes, and the third is ideology. He has an allergic reaction to it. Now, by ideology, this is what I mean, and I think this is what he means. He means a worldview that is closed in on itself. Right? That is actually not about people, it's about ideas. And it poses a set of questions that answer itself, that answer themselves. Right? An ideology is a kind of circular, it has a circular explanatory power. An ideology is a false idol because it seemingly omniscient by virtue of that circularity, right? And we see these ideologies everywhere. They're ideologies of the left or of the right, or I imagine someone has a centrist ideology somewhere. We see them in our own church, right? In other words, it is an ideology is contrary to a generous intellectual disposition because it answers its own questions, right? It is a set of propositions that are wielded as a weapon. And I'm sure we all have this. We have all experienced this. And we have all had these idols in our own lives, right? Which brings me to my final point, which I think is something that's very important that the Pope is calling us to, and comes from his experience as a Jesuit. When Father Spadaro asked him in that interview that we were privileged to publish in America, who is Jorge Mario Bergoglio, he answered, I am a sinner. Right? And that answer has gotten a lot of press, right? It's a very impressive answer. It's the right answer for a Christian, I think. I'm a sinner. But later on, you will recall in that very same interview, he talked about his image of the church today as a field hospital after a battle, right? And if you put that image together with his answer to that first question, what you realize is that the Pope sees himself first and foremost as a patient in the hospital, right? Not as initially the physician or the nurse, but as the patient, right? And only and so in that sense, he sees his ministry and he sees our ministries as that of wounded healers at work after a battle, right? And why is that important? It's important because what it means is that the church's witness today, our witness to each other and our witness to the world, must proceed out of this lived reality of the sheer gratuity of our creation and redemption. It must proceed in a penitential key, right? It must begin with how we have failed, right? What we have done and failed to do, right? Or it risks taking on the character of a secular slugfest, right? We each have to be able to say, I am a sinner, right? And in that way, is the public witness of the church truly credible, right? For love alone is credible, as Von Balthasar taught us. And that all of us have to be able to say, I am a sinner, Jesus Christ has saved me, Jesus Christ has saved you, right? That is the essence of the missionary character of the church today and always. And so it's not so much that the Pope is radically changing the church. He isn't doing that. The Pope isn't a radical in that sense, right? He's not a revolutionary. He doesn't really have answers as much as he has questions, right? And what he's saying is, be not afraid to ask the questions, because we have a faith in the living and true God, the one who is truth, a faith that gives us the freedom to wonder, to dream anew, even to be wrong. Right? And only in that way will what the church proposes to the world be heard and will enter people's hearts. So, thank you very much. I think we have a couple of minutes. I'd be happy to take some questions or comments. Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So my question is, I love Pope Francis. I love the appointments that he's made. But my question for you is, how do you see the priorities of our U.S. bishops lining up with the vision of Pope Francis?
Right. Yes, of course. How do I see the priorities of the U.S. bishops lining up with Pope Francis's priorities? Right. So I would say that they are lining up in really dramatic and creative ways. Right. I think it's always important. Since I just outlined this kind of personalist approach that I think the Pope is inviting us to take, it's always, in light of that, I think it's always important to remember that there really is no such thing as the bishops, right? If by that we mean a group of people who all think the same way and all have the same priorities and all vote the same way and all have the same spiritualities and so forth. Most of them are white. They're all male, so they're very same in that way. But there is a surprising amount of diversity among them, right? And that's actually what you want, right? Because they need to be able to respond to the church's call. They need to be able to govern in a specific place and time, their see. And the challenges of that see are going to be different from the challenges of that see. So I think it's always important to remember that when we speak of the bishops, we're really speaking of something that doesn't really exist in a kind of homogeneous way. Well, what I would say is this. Everywhere I go in this country, and I travel all over this country, and have for the last 5 years, I encounter a church that is less afraid, right? And that is a sign that the Spirit is at work, right? The upcoming event in Orlando, the convocation, where the bishops are going to roll out what is a very old model, but for the governance of the Church in the United States, actually a new model, in which they discern together with the lay pastoral leadership the pastoral strategy of the Church in the United States. I think that that's a great sign of change. I think the fact that the work that Bishop Robert McElroy has done in San Diego to create a synod at the diocesan level, that's very impressive, right? The fact that my colleague in America, James Martin, has just written what I think is a very thoughtful book, a very thoughtful set of reflections that challenge both the leadership of the Church and gay and lesbian people around those issues, and the fact that that book has been endorsed by 2 members of the College of Cardinals, I think that that's a sign that we're a little less afraid to talk about these things than we might have been, right? It doesn't mean that we have all of the answers, doesn't mean that we're perfect, doesn't mean that, the bishops are human beings, some of them are better than others, but I think what I see is there's less fear, and that is true throughout the Church in the United States, from the bishops on down.
My question would be about the beautiful description you've given of Francis and his practical reality in dealing with Cardinal Burke, and all of the feelings that are in the Church here on both sides of that. How does he get the skill to bring that to a connection without being divisive?
You mean, how does who get that?
How does Francis deal with the constant confrontation from Burke, and then he responds in a way that it's very, very delicate. to keep the church, and he's got thousands of these issues, but that's the one that's
Yeah.
popular.
Yeah, I think a couple of things about that. Thank you. That's a very thoughtful question. I think, first of all, it's important, just as we may not know the bishops as a group, we don't know them individually apart from their public actions. And so we don't want to judge what is in Cardinal Burke's heart any more than we can actually judge what's in Pope Francis's heart. These are things known only to God. And I think it's very important that we not scapegoat. I'm not suggesting you're doing this, by the way, but I think it's worth saying here that we not scapegoat the people with whom we disagree, right? Because if our dialogue, if our debate even as a church is simply an extension of our secular politics, in which there's a left and a right, and people win and some people lose, then we have really failed. We have utterly failed to realize who we are and who we are called to be simultaneously. So I would say that, I don't know the ins and outs, as it were, of the tension between Cardinal Burke and his colleagues and the Holy Father, but I think that the way in which the Pope has responded to it, at least in the public sphere, is encouraging to me, because what he's saying is it's actually okay to have a different point of view, right? That on matters of on matters that are important to the church, we can actually have different points of view, and that's okay. And in that sense, he has used his authority, as he did at the Synod on the Family. He's used his authority to safeguard diversity, which I think is a very great use of that authority. I think that that's actually the purpose of the Petrine authority. In other words, the Petrine authority does not exist to enforce unanimity, right? But to make diversity possible, right? And that's what he's done. When he opened up the Synod on the Family in Rome, he was very clear. He said, people can have different ideas. People can feel the Spirit is calling us to a different place. He said, and we can talk about those things here. We don't need to be afraid, because A, we have faith in the one who is truth and his Spirit, which is here guiding us, and also Peter is here, right? And so, that to me is encouraging. I happen to like the fact, maybe some of you don't, but I like the fact that our leaders these days sometimes publicly disagree with each other, right? I think that can be healthy, Obviously, we don't want it in essential dogmatic matters, and we don't want that disagreement to lead to schism and so forth, but by showing the world, but by realizing anew that we can actually have a conversation as a church where there is spirited disagreement, and yet we can still be one, then that disagreement can be expressed charitably, then we have not only realized, I think, what the Holy Spirit hopes for the church in its pilgrim progress, but we will then have a model that we can hold up to the rest of the world and say, actually, you know what? See, that's possible. It's possible for a people, a group, to do that. So I like how the Pope is handling this. Yes.
I went through the spiritual exercises 20 years ago, and it was transformational in my life. And for the last few years, I have been facilitating groups at my parish. I'm about to invite people to sign up for fall groups. I think it's a small group setting. I just got a Tetlo's notebook.
Yeah.
The structure. If you have any suggestions, I find that once people come, they fall in love with the prayer process, and beautiful way the Holy Spirit works through it. Getting people to take that first step and is scared.
Yeah.
So if you have any suggestions on how to invite people to the
Yes. Well, I think perhaps this is obvious, and I'm sure you do, but I think that the first way is that we have to give an account of the joy that the experience has brought us, right? So only joy is credible, only love is credible, only those things are attractive to people, and they have an ability to attract people that arguments that do not, right? And you know, popular incentives do not. So I would say first is to really live our faith and our experience of the exercises or whatever our spirituality is joyfully and openly, right? That's very attractive. I think that the second is, and I'm sure you're doing this work, is to take advantage of the many ways in which the exercises can be adapted to meet people where they are in their lives, because not only are there provisions for that within the exercises themselves, there are countless models throughout the country, and the Institute for Jesuit Sources at Boston College keeps a database of those, which can be useful to consult. I would also say that I think it's important, in my own experience, it's important to, as we say, meet people where they are, and not so much invite them into an experience as enter into their experience and propose, a way for them to come to terms with it. It's a subtle difference, but it's important. And I think that requires us to account for the ways in which people learn, people pray, people come to God. So, for example, we have a challenge in our retreat houses, the Jesuit retreat houses in the United States, in that most of the folks who go to those retreat houses and do the spiritual exercises and have these incredibly grace-filled experiences are women, right? And so the Jesuits have been asking ourselves, what's going on here? Why can't we get men in here? And after some long analysis and some work down at the Jesuit Retreat Center in Grand Coteau, they realized men approach this in a different way, right, than women do. And that the way in for a lot of men was to begin with a preached retreat, right? So they could come together, and the retreat was about, listening to somebody preach, and then going off and reflecting on that, thinking about it, praying about it, and coming back, rather than starting with the one-on-one, right? And that has led to this waiting list for these preached retreats for men. And it was just a simple adaptation, right? But basically we said, rather than trying to impose an experience on everyone, let's actually listen to what they're saying to us and how they learn and how they grow, how they change, and then adapt. And that's just one example, I think, that's been very useful. And I applaud the society for being willing to learn anew there. And maybe these folks will eventually be taking a one-on-one directed retreat, but that's not how they're going to begin, right? So, those are my thoughts on that. Yes?
Mine is more of a reflection, maybe you can reflect back to me and just comment that I really appreciated how you explained the personal quality of what Francis was trying to do rather than the propositional. I know I've had many people say to me, well, they disagree with him, like consider the family, consider the family, and someone sent me an article, some archbishop, and I live in Rome, as a matter of fact, so I hear a lot about it. And but they sent me an article of some archbishop in Kansas who wrote against the Amoris Laetitia, And it seems to me that he is coming from such a wealth of kind of human experience and complications of life that people get into. that he wants to respond in a more compassionate way. And of course, this is my issue, that I go to sometimes in church, there's this, at least from some of the bishops and some of the people I've talked to, they want things hard and fast, with in terms of marriage and people, divorce, receiving communion and things like that, And he seems to me to come from he's had so much experience in terms of how complicated life is with people. And it seems that he's approaching with great compassion for that space.
Yes, I think that that's right. And I think what he's saying to us is not that we need to do something new, that we need to do what we've always done in a new way, right? And that's, I think, essential to understanding him. In other words, the church's teaching, what it teaches, has to be appropriated. It has to be received by people. And in the world in which we live today, though this has always been true, the world in which we live today, that reality is very, very messy. It's very, very complicated, right? But it's not the church. It's not. I think what Francis would say is it's not the church's teaching that's messy. It's how that's lived that's very, very messy. And what he said repeatedly, if you listen to his or read his homilies in the morning, is you just can't say, "Here it is. Go do that. Good luck. We're praying for you," right? We have to say, "Here is the experience that we have inherited, that we have received as gift, and here is how the church understands it at this moment in history. And now we're going to walk with you through the struggle of appropriating that in your life, because we're struggling too, right? I mean, this is not straightforward. I don't think that there is a person alive who hasn't struggled with some teaching of the church, right? And that we need to pastor and minister to people from that experience, right? Not from the clarity of our ideas, but from the faith that gives us the freedom to inhabit the messiness of our lives, right? And he's very comfortable there. And I would also say that the great enemy of faith, well, the enemy of truth, as you know, is certainty. The great enemy of faith is fear, right? And there's a certain amount of, when I say I've seen less fear in the church, I've also seen some fear quite visible, right? And it particularly manifests itself in a lack of faith that we are in fact being guided by the Holy Spirit in this. I always say that people on the so-called right have a lack of faith in the Holy Spirit, and people on the so-called left have too much faith in human beings, right? And of course, as Catholic Christians, we can't be liberal and conservative. We're necessarily both. People ask me, "Are you liberal or conservative?" I say, yes, right? I'm a Catholic. I'm by definition both, right? That's how we are still here, right? We are the only institution that survived the fall of the Roman Empire, right? We're still here, and the work of the church goes on. People are being fed, and people are being housed, and people are being brought to the Lord, and that's really, really good news. We're not going to be brought down by a few of us having the wrong ideas about what to do right now, and we're not going to be brought down by, badly worded press releases. Two world wars and a Reformation, and the 2016 election. I mean, these things didn't bring us down, right? We're still here. We have the promise of Jesus Christ. "I will be with you always, and the gates of hell will not prevail against you." So don't be afraid. Don't worry. You can do this, is what the Spirit is saying to us. Yeah.
My question's going to be about the spiritual exercises of Pope Francis, but I want to take this opportunity to thank you for the diversity using your authority as editor. I've been reading it for 40 years and I'm seeing some wonderful diversity, which of course what you just said about yourself as a Catholic, I hope.
Right.
My question about Pope Francis, one of his predecessors, St. John XXIII, was very assiduous in his annual retreat and being the exercise. You read in the story of a journal of the soul. How is Pope Francis able to, with a busy schedule and everything, and first precisely, the exercises are very useful for a person in a very active apostolate.
Right.
But does he, I know that all popes make their annual retreat, but is he doing it with Jesuits, or what kind of contact does he maintain with his Jesuit groups and spirituality? It's obvious in his preaching about the sermon, he speaks a lot about the sermon, but
Right.
as far as the practice,
Right.
what practices does he have?
Yeah. Well, I mean, apart from his, his obligations to pray the office and to take an annual retreat and so forth, he's a very prayerful person, and he's very Ignatian in his approach to the spiritual life, because the ideal of a Jesuit for Saint Ignatius was a contemplative in action, right? And in that sense, the spiritual exercises over time, you retreat into the spiritual exercises and into this experience of the life of Jesus Christ. You begin to judge the lights and shadows in your own life in light of the one who is light. But over time, that then becomes an advance into the world. And the very deliberate reflection of the spiritual exercises acquires the form of a habit, right? And I have, in my own life, discovered this, much to my surprise, that, over time, through the repetition of these exercises, they become a habit, and you find yourself thinking in this way unconsciously. And it's such a delight to me in my own life at one point to realize that this was happening, that grace was unfolding in this way. And so I think that you can see this in him because he's profoundly centered, right? He's centered on the Lord. He's not afraid. He has great freedom. And those are all marks of the Spirit. And I don't know the specifics of how he prays and what contacts he has, but I would imagine that he's had that similar experience, because it's very common among Jesuits for the exercises to become more of a habit rather than a conscious intention. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, one more.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for your tutorial on the spiritual exercises and how they influenced our Pope Francis. And when you did that, it raised an issue in my mind, and that issue was, if his background in the spiritual exercises have such a strong influence on what he says and he does, without that understanding as background, the average listener
Yep.
is not going to be able to really fully understand or appreciate what he's saying. I'm not so sure about the religious and clerical folks in Rome. I would think they would have some understanding of that. But do you feel it's your obligation in American Magazine, and do you feel that there are other Catholic media that have a responsibility to provide that background so that this Pope's philosophy and teachings are better appreciated?
Yes, is the answer, and we're trying to do that at America. I invite you all to subscribe and let us know whether we are. If you don't subscribe, it's only a venial sin, don't worry. But it's easily remedied. I would just say this about that, and thank you so much for having me here today. It's been a real pleasure. This is the challenge with having a religious as Pope, right? And why we don't do it, why it's the exception to the rule, right? Because there's a temptation, I think, to want to take the charism of your order and make it universal, right? And my reservation, my concern about Pope Francis is in this area. Not everybody's meant to be a Jesuit, right? And not everybody's meant to live Catholic Christianity like that. And sometimes I think he presumes too much on the part of people who aren't. Here's an example. He gave an address to the Roman Curia a couple of Christmases ago that was about the dangers of vice and pride and all of these things. And I mean, imagine like your boss giving this talk at a Christmas party, right? Like, it's like, Merry Christmas, everybody. Right. Now, I recognized immediately what it was, because it belongs to a genre of speech that is proper to a novice master speaking to his novices. And I've seen my novice master talk to us like that, and I've seen our superiors talk to us like that today, right? It's very familiar to me. I understand that language, and I understand that genre of language. But he wasn't speaking to a bunch of Jesuits. And so a number of diocesan priests told me, God, he's really hard on these guys, right? And so I think that's the specific challenge for him is to recall that, not everybody is a Jesuit, not everybody's a religious, and it's important for us to remember, having a Jesuit pope, once every 400 years is probably about right. Thank you all very much. God bless.